Garrett's hands moved before his mind could catch up. Eleanor wasn't breathing. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. "Don't you dare," he screamed at her unconscious face. "I love you, and you don't get to die until you hear me say it while you're awake." 30 compressions. 2 breaths. Eleanor gasped, coughed, breathed. But that moment came later. This story begins 6 weeks earlier when she had 3 minutes to live. She had 3 minutes to live. The rope bit into her wrists, cutting through skin that had already bled dry. Blood traced thin lines down her forearms, freezing in the late afternoon air of autumn 1874. 3 men stood in a loose circle around the tree where she was bound, their breath coming out in white clouds. The one with the whip raised his arm slowly, savoring the moment before the strike. This is the story of how a mountain man saved a nun twice his size, and why that decision almost killed them both. The clearing sat 2 miles from Garrett Blackwell's cabin, carved into the pine forest by a lightning strike 3 summers back. The burned tree still stood at its center, black and skeletal against the amber light filtering through the canopy. Eleanor Wright was tied to that tree, her back pressed against charred bark, her face turned upward toward a sky she thought she might never see again. Clayton Marsh circled her like a wolf studying prey. He was 40 years old, lean as winter, with a face marked by scars that told the story of 2 decades spent hunting things that could fight back. The whip in his hand was well used, the leather soft and supple from blood and sweat. Behind him stood Pike, younger by 15 years, nervous energy making his hands shake as he gripped his rifle. To the left was Rufus, thick-set and eager, the kind of man who enjoyed other people's pain. Clayton stopped directly in front of Eleanor. Her head came up to his chin, even sitting. Standing, she would tower over all 3 of them. That fact seemed to offend him on some primal level. "Last chance, woman." His voice was quiet, almost gentle. That made it worse. "Where's the money your uncle hid?" Eleanor met his eyes without flinching. Her face was marked with bruises, old and new, creating a map of violence in shades of purple and yellow and sick green. Blood had dried at the corner of her mouth, but her eyes burned with something that made Clayton take an involuntary step back. "I told you." Her voice was low, rough from screaming earlier. "There is no money." Clayton's jaw tightened. He raised the whip again, higher this time. The leather uncoiled behind him like a serpent preparing to strike. 200 yards away on a ridge overlooking the clearing, Garrett Blackwell lay flat against the cold ground. His Sharps rifle rested on a fallen log, the barrel steady despite the racing of his heart. He had been checking his trap lines when he heard the woman's voice carrying through the trees. Not screaming. Worse. The kind of controlled agony that came from someone who had learned that screaming didn't help. He should have stayed hidden, should have turned around and gone back to his cabin and pretended he had heard nothing. That was what 6 years of isolation had taught him. Other people's problems got you killed. Other people's problems reminded you of things you had spent 6 years trying to forget. But then she looked up. The angle was wrong for him to see her face clearly. Just the shape of it, the turn of her head, the way the afternoon light caught in her dark hair. For one terrible moment, he saw Rose. His daughter. 6 years old, forever buried in a grave 200 miles away, next to her mother. His finger found the trigger. The decision made itself. The shot cracked across the clearing like thunder, sending birds exploding from the trees. The bullet struck the ground 3 feet in front of Clayton, kicking up a spray of dirt and pine needles. The whip fell from his hand as he dove for cover, his 2 men following suit with the practiced efficiency of men who had been shot at before. Garrett's voice carried down from the ridge, amplified by the natural acoustics of the bowl-shaped clearing. "Cut her loose. Right away. You have 10 seconds." Clayton pressed himself against a boulder, his hand already on his pistol. His eyes scanned the tree line, trying to locate the shooter. The angle of the shot told him everything he needed to know. High ground, long rifle, someone who knew what they were doing. Pike crawled up beside him, his face pale. "That's Blackwell. They say he never misses." Clayton had heard the stories. Everyone in the territory had. The hermit who lived on the mountain, the man who could track a deer through fresh snow and skin a beaver in under 5 minutes. The widower who had lost his family and decided to lose himself in the wilderness rather than face what remained. The kind of man who, if he chose to kill you, would do it before you even knew he was there. Clayton weighed his options with the cold calculation of a professional. 3 men with pistols against 1 man with a rifle at 200 yards. The mathematics were bad. Even if they rushed the ridge, at least one of them would die before they reached cover, maybe all 3. And for what? $300 split 3 ways, not worth dying over. "Cut her loose, boys." He kept his eyes on the ridge as he spoke. "We'll come back." Rufus looked like he wanted to argue, but Pike was already moving his knife out. He sawed through the ropes, binding Eleanor's wrists with hands that shook. She didn't move as the rope fell away, didn't rub her wrists or try to stand, just sat there against the burned tree watching them with those dark eyes. Clayton stood slowly, hands visible, moving toward his horse with careful steps. As he swung into the saddle, he looked back at Eleanor. His voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. "Your uncle's paying $300. We'll be back." Then they were gone, 3 riders disappearing into the forest, leaving nothing behind but hoof prints and the smell of fear. Eleanor sat against the tree, listening to the sound of hooves fade. Her wrists burned where the rope had cut through. Her back ached from the beating they had given her before tying her up. She could taste blood in her mouth from the punch that had split her lip, but she was alive. The sound of boots on stone made her look up. The man coming down from the ridge moved like he was part of the landscape. Not young, but not old either. Somewhere in that hard middle ground where age meant experience instead of weakness. He was lean in the way of men who had missed too many meals, with a face weathered by 20 years of mountain sun and wind. A beard streaked with gray covered his jaw. A scar ran down his left cheek, white against tanned skin. He carried the Sharps rifle like it was an extension of his arm. Eleanor watched him approach, trying to read his intention in the way he moved. She had learned to judge men by their gaits. The ones who swaggered were usually cowards underneath. The ones who moved quiet were the dangerous ones. This man moved like water finding its path downhill. Inevitable. Unstoppable, if he chose to be. He stopped 10 feet away, the rifle now pointed at the ground. His eyes took in everything. The blood on her wrists, the bruises on her face, the torn black dress that might once have been a nun's habit, the fact that she was easily 6 inches taller than him, even sitting down. "Can you stand?" His voice was rough from disuse. Eleanor tested her legs, wincing as cramped muscles protested. "I can try." She got her feet under her and pushed up, using the tree for support. Standing, she was 6 feet 2 inches tall, with shoulders broad as a man's and arms corded with muscle. The man with the rifle had to tilt his head back to meet her eyes. If her size bothered him, he didn't show it. He pulled a canteen from his belt and held it out. "Small sips. Your stomach won't handle more." Eleanor took the canteen with hands that trembled. The water was cold and clean, and the best thing she had tasted in 3 days. She forced herself to follow his instruction, taking small mouthfuls, fighting the urge to gulp it down. "Thank you." She handed the canteen back. He studied her face with the focused attention of someone reading a map. "You're bleeding. Wrists mostly. That cut on your lip needs cleaning or it'll infect." Eleanor looked down at her hands. The rope burns went deep enough that she could see white bone at her wrist. She had felt it happen, but hadn't let herself acknowledge the pain. Acknowledging pain meant acknowledging weakness, and weakness got you killed. "I've had worse." Something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or memory. He shrugged the pack off his shoulders and knelt, pulling out a leather pouch. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he crushed dried leaves between his palms, spitting into the powder to make a paste. "This is going to hurt." He wasn't lying. The yarrow poultice burned like liquid fire when he pressed it into her wounds. Eleanor's jaw clenched, but she didn't make a sound. She had learned at St. Agnes that making noise only encouraged them. Stay quiet. Stay still. Survive. He wrapped her wrists with strips of clean cloth, his touch careful despite the calluses on his hands. When he finished, he stood and stepped back, putting distance between them again. "You're Garrett Blackwell." It wasn't a question. He paused in the act of shouldering his pack. "How do you know my name?" "Everyone knows the hermit, the man who lost his family." The words hit him like a physical blow. She saw it in the way his shoulders tightened, the way his eyes went somewhere else for just a moment. When he looked at her again, the shutters were back up. "My cabin's 2 miles north. You need food and rest." Eleanor tested her weight on her legs. The world tilted slightly, exhaustion and pain catching up with her now that the immediate danger had passed. "Why are you helping me?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old guilt. "Because I didn't help someone once, and she died." Eleanor looked at him differently then, seeing past the beard and the scars to the man underneath. A man carrying his own wounds invisible, but no less real than the ones marking her skin. "I can walk," she said. They moved through the forest in silence. Garrett let his eyes constantly scanning the trees, reading signs that Eleanor couldn't see. She followed each step an exercise in will over body. Her legs wanted to quit. Her back screamed at her to lie down and give up. But she had survived 12 years of forced labor at St. Agnes Convent. She had survived the 3 days since Clayton Marsh and his men had grabbed her outside Silver Ridge. She would survive this too. The cabin appeared through the trees like something from a fever dream. Small, built from logs that had weathered to silver gray. A stone chimney rose from one end, thin smoke curling from it into the darkening sky. One room maybe 12 feet by 12 feet. A single window facing south, shutters closed against the cold. It was the loneliest-looking place Eleanor had ever seen. Garrett reached the door first and stopped his hand on the latch. "Door frame's low. You'll need to duck." Eleanor nodded and bent as she crossed the threshold. She didn't bend far enough. Her forehead hit the upper frame with a solid thunk. She stopped stuck halfway through the door, unable to move forward or back. Behind her, she heard a sound that might have been a cough, or might have been something else. "Don't." Her voice was muffled by the doorframe. "Don't what?" "Don't laugh." Garrett bit his lip so hard it started bleeding. His shoulders shook with the effort of containment. It was the first time in 6 years he had wanted to laugh, and the absurdity of the situation made it even harder to suppress. He put a hand on her shoulder and guided her down and through. Eleanor straightened up inside the cabin, her face burning with embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I forget sometimes how tall I am." Garrett wiped blood from his lip, his eyes still bright with suppressed humor. "No harm done." The cabin's interior matched its exterior for Spartan efficiency. A narrow bed in one corner covered with fur blankets. A table and 2 chairs near the fireplace. Shelves holding supplies in neat rows. Everything clean and organized and utterly devoid of comfort. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a single photograph in a simple wooden frame. A young woman with dark hair and gentle eyes. A little girl in her lap, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with the same dark hair and her father's serious expression. Eleanor felt something twist in her chest at the sight of them. Garrett moved to the fireplace and stirred the coals, adding wood until flames crackled to life. He filled a pot with water from a barrel by the door and hung it over the fire to heat. His movements had the unconscious grace of long practice, every action efficient, nothing wasted. Eleanor watched him and thought about the last time someone had taken care of her. Patrick, the groundskeeper at St. Agnes. But that hadn't been care, not really. That had been something else entirely. "Sit." Garrett gestured to one of the chairs. Eleanor sat, and the chair creaked alarmingly under her weight. She started to stand, but Garrett shook his head. "It'll hold. I built it to last." He ladled soup from a pot that had been simmering at the edge of the fire, rabbit by the smell of it, with wild onions and some kind of root vegetable. He filled a bowl and handed it to her with a spoon carved from wood. Eleanor looked down at the bowl, then up at him. The question formed before she could stop it. "Aren't you afraid of me?" Garrett paused in the act of filling his own bowl. "Should I be? Most people are. Most men, anyway. They look at me like I'm something unnatural." He set the pot down and met her eyes across the small space. "I see a woman who's been through hell and came out the other side still breathing. That's all." The words hit harder than any blow Clayton Marsh had landed. Eleanor felt her throat tighten, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. When was the last time someone had looked at her and seen a woman instead of a freak? She lowered her eyes to the soup and began to eat. The food was simple but good, seasoned with herbs Eleanor didn't recognize. She ate slowly, forcing herself not to gulp it down despite the hunger gnawing at her stomach. Garrett ate across from her, his eyes on the fire, giving her the privacy to compose herself. When she finished, she set the bowl aside and pulled the blanket he had given her tighter around her shoulders. The cabin was warm now, the fire driving back the evening cold. Outside, darkness had fallen complete. The only sounds were the crackle of burning wood and the distant call of an owl. "Why were those men after you?" Garrett's voice was quiet, but it cut through her thoughts. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, weighing how much to tell him. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, but this man had saved her life. That had to count for something. "They think my uncle hid money before he died." "Did he?" "I don't know. I haven't seen him in 12 years. Garrett looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "Where were you?" Eleanor's hands tightened on the blanket. "St. Agnes Convent, New Mexico Territory." "You're a nun." "Was. They released me 3 months ago." "Why?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications Eleanor wasn't ready to unpack. She met his eyes and saw only curiosity there, not judgment, not pity, just the simple desire to understand. "I'll tell you tomorrow," she said quietly, "if I'm still here." Garrett nodded and stood, moving to the bed. He pulled the fur blankets off and carried them to the floor near the fireplace. "You take the bed. I'll sleep here." Eleanor started to protest, but he cut her off with a look. "You're injured. I'm not. The bed's yours." She wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at her like an undertow. 3 days of running, 3 days of fear. The last reserves of her strength had carried her this far and no further. Eleanor moved to the bed and sat down. The mattress was stuffed with pine needles and gave off a sharp, clean smell. The remaining blanket was heavy and warm. "Thank you," she said quietly. Garrett was already settling onto the floor, his back to her, the Sharps rifle within easy reach. "Get some sleep. We'll talk more in the morning." Eleanor lay back and pulled the blanket up to her chin. The bed was narrow but comfortable. The cabin was warm. For the first time in 3 days, she felt safe. She slipped her hand under the pillow and felt the reassuring shape of the knife she had hidden there while Garrett's back was turned. The blade was small, barely 4 inches, stolen from Clayton's pack before they had tied her to the tree. It wouldn't be much use against 3 armed men, but it was something. She couldn't afford to trust anyone. Not completely. Not yet. Across the cabin, Garrett lay on the floor and stared at the dying fire. He heard the small sound of metal against wood as Eleanor shifted the knife under her pillow. He said nothing. He understood the need for that small measure of control. 6 years. 6 years since he had shared space with another human being. 6 years since he had cared whether anyone lived or died. Margaret had died asking why he wasn't there. Rose had died calling for her papa. He had promised himself he would never let that happen again. The only way to keep that promise was to never care about anyone again. To stay alone on his mountain and let the world forget he existed. But now there was a woman sleeping in his bed. A woman twice his size, with bruises mapping her skin and eyes that held the same kind of pain he saw in the mirror every morning. What the hell was he doing? The fire crackled. The owl called again, closer now, and Garrett Blackwell, hermit and widower and man who had given up on everything except survival, lay awake and wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had made the right choice for once. Morning came gray and cold. Garrett woke before dawn, as he always did, his body trained by 20 years of hunting to rise with the first light. He lay still for a moment, orienting himself, remembering why there was another person breathing in his cabin. Eleanor was curled on her side, one hand tucked under the pillow where the knife was hidden. Even in sleep she kept herself protected. Her face had relaxed, and he could see how young she really was. Late 20s, maybe. Too young to have those kinds of scars. He rose quietly and rebuilt the fire-setting coffee to boil and bacon to fry in the cast-iron skillet. The familiar routine calmed his nerves. This he knew how to do. Make coffee, cook meat, survive another day. The smell of food brought Eleanor awake. She sat up slowly, wincing as bruised muscles protested. For a moment she looked confused, her eyes scanning the cabin like she didn't know where she was. Then memory returned and her shoulders relaxed fractionally. "Morning?" Garrett didn't turn from the stove. "Coffee's almost ready." Eleanor stood and moved to the window, pushing the shutters open. Gray light flooded in, revealing a world locked in winter's approach. The trees were bare, their branches black against an iron sky. Snow dusted the ground, not deep yet, but promising more to come. "How cold does it get up here?" "Cold enough to kill you if you're not prepared." Garrett poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "Below zero most nights come January." He handed her a cup, and their fingers brushed. Eleanor felt the calluses on his hands, the scars from a lifetime of rough work. Working hands, honest hands. She took the coffee and wrapped both hands around the cup, savoring the warmth. The first sip was bitter and strong and perfect. They ate in companionable silence. Bacon and cornbread left over from the day before. Simple food, but Eleanor ate like it was a feast. Garrett watched her from the corner of his eye and wondered how long it had been since she had eaten a real meal. After breakfast, Eleanor stood and moved toward the door. "I should help with the wood." "You're injured. Rest." "I've had worse." She opened the door and stepped outside before he could argue. Garrett followed, pulling on his coat. Outside, the world was quiet in the way only winter mornings could be. No birds singing, no wind. Just the crunch of frost under their boots and the white clouds of their breath. A tree had fallen during the night, brought down by age and the weight of ice. It lay across the clearing behind the cabin, a massive pine trunk easily 200 pounds. Garrett looked at it and mentally calculated how long it would take to saw it into manageable pieces. Most of the morning, probably. He would need to get the saw from the shed. He turned to tell Eleanor to stay inside where it was warm. She was already at the tree. Before he could speak, she bent and wrapped her arms around the trunk. Her muscles flexed under the thin fabric of her dress. She straightened, lifting the entire trunk off the ground with a grunt of effort. Garrett's coffee cup slipped from his hand and shattered on the frozen ground. Eleanor carried the trunk 20 feet to the chopping area and set it down gently. Then she straightened and turned, freezing when she saw his expression. "I'm sorry." The words came out in a rush. "I forget sometimes." Garrett stared at her, his mind refusing to process what he had just seen. 200 pounds, maybe more, lifted like it was a bundle of kindling. "How?" His voice came out hoarse. "How are you doing that?" Eleanor's face flushed with something that might have been shame. "I've always been like this, strong." She moved back toward the cabin, but Garrett stepped into her path. Not threatening, just needing to understand. "Tell me." Eleanor looked down at her hands, turning them over like she was seeing them for the first time. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. "When I was 10 years old, I could wrestle grown men to the ground. My father's friends used to test it at gatherings, thinking it was funny, until I broke one man's arm. After that, it stopped being funny." She wrapped her arms around herself, but not against the cold. "My parents thought I was touched by the devil. Too big, too strong, too different. The local preacher said I needed to be purified, that God would cure me if I just prayed hard enough and worked hard enough." "But you didn't get cured." "No, I just got stronger." Eleanor sat down on the fallen tree trunk and Garrett sat beside her. The cold soaked through his pants, but he didn't move. "They sent me to St. Agnes when I was 16. The sisters there had a reputation for handling difficult cases. Girls who were too wild, too rebellious, too broken to fit anywhere else." Her voice took on a flat quality, like she was reciting facts instead of living through memories. "The Mother Superior said hard labor would purify the abnormality in me. So I worked, hauling water from wells 100 feet deep, breaking rocks for new buildings, digging graves for the sisters who died and the girls who didn't survive their cures." Garrett felt his hands curl into fists. 12 years. I spent 12 years thinking there was something wrong with me. that if I just worked hard enough, prayed hard enough, suffered enough, God would fix me. She looked up at him then, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. But you know what the worst part was? It wasn't the work. It wasn't even the beatings when I didn't move fast enough or pray hard enough. It was the silence. The way the sisters looked through me like I was furniture, like I didn't exist unless they needed something moved. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said in a voice rough with conviction, "They were wrong." Eleanor blinked. "What?" "Your parents, the preacher, the sisters. They were all wrong." He turned to face her fully. "There's nothing abnormal about being strong." The words seemed to hit her like a physical force. She stared at him, searching his face for the lie, the mockery, the pity, finding none of it. "You're the first person who ever said that." "Then everyone else is a fool." Something cracked in Eleanor's chest, some wall she had built brick by brick over 12 years of being told she was wrong. She was broken. She was too much. Her eyes burned, and she couldn't stop the tears this time. Garrett sat beside her and said nothing. Just let her cry. Let her grieve for the girl who had believed the lies and the woman who had survived despite them. When the tears finally stopped, Eleanor wiped her face with the back of her hand. She felt hollowed out but somehow lighter, like something poisonous had been lanced from a wound. "Thank you." Garrett stood and offered his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. She towered over him by half a foot, but somehow it didn't feel wrong. It felt right in a way nothing had felt right in a very long time. "Come on," he said. "I'll teach you how to check trap lines." They spent the morning working together, moving through the forest in a rhythm that felt natural despite having just met. Garrett showed her how to read animal tracks in the frost, how to set a snare so the animal died quickly instead of suffering, how to move through the woods without disturbing the patterns that prey animals followed. Eleanor absorbed everything with quick intelligence, asking questions that showed she understood not just the mechanics but the reasoning behind them. Garrett found himself explaining more than he needed to, enjoying the simple pleasure of sharing knowledge with someone who wanted to learn. By midday, they had checked all 12 trap lines and come away with 2 rabbits and a marten. Good hunting for this late in the season. They returned to the cabin to find the world changed. Fresh hoofprints circled the clearing, distinct in the frost. 3 horses moving together, stopping to observe. The tracks led to a spot 50 yards from the cabin where the riders had dismounted and stood for several minutes before riding away. Garrett knelt and studied the prints with a tracker's eye. Made within the last 2 hours while they were checking the far trap lines. The horses were shod, which meant they weren't wild. And they had come right up to the cabin windows before retreating. His jaw tightened as he stood. "They found you." Eleanor's face went pale beneath the bruises. "I have to leave." "Leave to where?" Garrett gestured at the forest. "They're mounted. You're on foot. They'll run you down in half a day." "I won't put you in danger." "Too late." He pointed at the tracks. "They saw you here. If you run now, they'll assume I'm hiding something worth killing for." Eleanor looked at the cabin, at this small sanctuary that had felt safe for exactly 1 night. "Then what do we do?" Garrett walked back to the cabin and began pulling weapons from their storage places. The Sharps rifle, a Winchester repeater, 2 Colt revolvers, a knife with a blade as long as his forearm. "We prepare." He showed her how to load and fire the Winchester, his hands covering hers to position the weapon correctly. She was strong enough to handle the recoil easily, and her aim, while unpracticed, showed promise. "If they come, you aim for center mass. Don't try for a headshot. Don't try to wound. You shoot to stop the threat, understand?" Eleanor nodded, her face set with grim determination. Garrett positioned her by the side window where she would have a clear field of fire across the clearing. Then he took his position at the front window with the Sharps. They waited as afternoon faded toward evening. The attack never came. But as darkness fell, Garrett saw something that made his blood run cold. A thin line of smoke rising from the forest half a mile to the east. Someone had made camp, close enough to watch, far enough to be safe from a surprise attack. They were being observed, studied. The predators were circling, learning their patterns, waiting for the right moment to strike. Eleanor saw it too. How long will they wait? As long as it takes. Men like that, they get paid for results, not speed. She moved away from the window and sat by the fire. The flickering light cast shadows across her face, making her look older than her years. I should tell you the rest, about why they want me. Garrett put down the rifle and sat across from her. I'm listening? Eleanor was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was steady. 3 months ago, a man came to St. Agnes, Reverend Josiah Crane, rich from mining investments in Denver, very respectable, very generous with his donations. She stared into the fire, seeing something other than flames. He watched me working in the courtyard one day. I was carrying stones for a new chapel, stones that took 2 other women to lift together. I was carrying them alone. Garrett already knew where this was going, his hands clenched on his knees. He spoke to the Mother Superior that evening, made her an offer, $500 to release me from my vows so I could come work in his household in Denver, as a servant. The word dripped with implication. The Mother Superior was thrilled. She said I should be grateful that anyone would want a freak like me, grateful for the chance to serve a man of God outside those walls. You refused. I told him I would rather die than belong to any man. Eleanor's voice hardened. I told him I wasn't property to be bought and sold. I told him that if he touched me, I would break every bone in his body. Despite everything, Garrett felt a flicker of admiration. What happened then? They beat me, 10 lashes a day for 2 weeks, locked me in the cellar without food or water, told me I was a traitor to God and didn't deserve to live among decent people. Her hands opened and closed, remembering. The night before Crane was supposed to collect me, I broke the cellar door. It took me 4 hours working in the dark, but I broke it. Then I went to the Mother Superior's office and took back the money my parents had sent with me when I was 16, my inheritance from my grandmother, $300 that they had kept as payment for my care. It was your money. That's what I thought. They called it theft. She looked at him across the fire. When Crane tried to stop me at the gate, when he grabbed my arm and tried to drag me back, I pushed him away. The firelight reflected in her eyes like dying suns. With my strength, that push broke his arm and cracked 3 of his ribs. They called it assault. Put a bounty on my head, $200 for my capture, dead or alive. Garrett was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning through the trees. The smoke from the distant campfire had disappeared, hidden by darkness, but he knew it was still there. The money you took was yours by right, he said finally. You didn't steal anything. And Crane, he tried to force you. What you did was self-defense. Eleanor looked at him with something like wonder. You believe me. Do you have any reason to lie to me? No. Then I believe you. Something changed in Eleanor's face. The hard mask she had worn since arriving cracked just slightly, and underneath Garrett glimpsed the woman she might have been if life had been kinder. Someone capable of trust. Someone capable of hope. Thank you, she whispered. Garrett reached out and placed his hand over hers where it rested on her knee. It was the first time he had deliberately touched her. He felt her flinch, an instinctive response to contact she couldn't control. Then she forced herself to relax, to accept the gesture for what it was. Comfort. Connection. The simple human need to not be alone. You're safe here, he said quietly. Whatever comes next, you're safe here. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, snow had begun to fall, small flakes drifting past the window. The first real snow of winter, covering everything in white, erasing the tracks of men who hunted for money and the footprints of those who ran. But tomorrow would bring new light, and with it, new dangers. For now, though, there was warmth and food and the fragile beginning of trust between 2 broken people who had found each other in the wilderness. Eleanor squeezed his hand once, then let go. I should sleep. Tomorrow might be difficult. It might, Garrett agreed. She moved to the bed while he arranged his blankets by the fire. The knife was still under her pillow. He still said nothing about it. But as Eleanor closed her eyes, her hand didn't reach for the blade. For the first time in 12 years, she felt safe enough to sleep without a weapon in her grip. Across the cabin, Garrett lay awake and stared at the ceiling. 6 years of isolation. 6 years of telling himself he was better off alone. 6 years of running from the guilt that Margaret and Rose had died while he was gone. And now, in the space of a single day, all of that careful distance was crumbling. He had looked at Eleanor and seen his daughter, had heard her story and felt his wife's ghost asking him why he hadn't been there to help, had touched her hand and felt something he thought had died 6 years ago. The terrifying, fragile possibility of caring about someone again. The snow continued to fall silent and relentless as night deepened over the mountain. And Garrett Blackwell, the hermit who had lost everything, wondered if perhaps he was being given a chance to find something new, something worth living for instead of just surviving, something worth fighting for when the men in the forest decided to stop watching and start moving. Because they would come, that was certain. The only question was whether he and Eleanor would be ready when they did. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Garrett woke before dawn, rebuilt the fire-made coffee while Eleanor still slept. She woke to the smell of it and emerged from the bed with that careful grace large people learned early, moving through the small space without disturbing anything. They worked together during daylight hours, checking traps, chopping wood, preparing for the winter that was coming whether they were ready or not. And beneath it all, the constant awareness of being watched. The smoke from the distant camp appeared each evening like clockwork, a silent reminder that Clayton Marsh and his men were patient. Professional hunters knew how to wait. On the fourth morning, Eleanor stood at the window watching gray light creep across the clearing. Frost etched patterns on the glass, delicate as lace, deadly as knives if you were caught outside without proper shelter. They're still there. She didn't need to specify who. Garrett joined her at the window, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He passed one to her, and their fingers brushed in the exchange. Neither pulled away as quickly as they had the first time. They'll make their move soon. Waiting costs them money and winter's coming. They can't afford to sit out here much longer. Eleanor took a sip of coffee, her eyes still on the forest. Why haven't they attacked already? Because they're not sure what they're dealing with. Garrett pointed at the cabin with his cup. 1 man, 1 woman, solid cover, high ground advantage. They saw what happened in the clearing. They know I can shoot. They don't know if there are more of us. Don't know what kind of weapons we have. Smart hunters gather information before they commit. And when they've gathered enough, then we'll be ready. But even as he said it, Garrett felt the weight of the lie. 2 people against 3 trained fighters, possibly more if Crane had hired additional men. The mathematics were bad, no matter how he calculated them. Eleanor seemed to sense his thoughts. She turned from the window and looked at him with those dark eyes that saw too much. Tell me about them. Your wife and daughter. The question caught him off guard. He almost deflected, almost retreated into the silence that had protected him for 6 years. But something about the morning light and the warmth of the coffee and the simple fact that she had asked made him answer. Margaret had dark hair, like yours. Rose had her mother's smile. He moved to the mantel and took down the photograph, handling it with the reverence of a holy relic. Eleanor came to stand beside him, looking at the faces frozen in silver and time. She was beautiful. She was. Garrett's voice was rough. We met when I was 22. I was working as a guide taking hunters into the high country. She was the daughter of the man who ran the trading post in Millbrook. Smart as hell and twice as stubborn. Despite the pain, he smiled at the memory. Took me 3 months to convince her to marry me. She said mountain men made terrible husbands because they loved the wilderness more than any woman. I told her she was wrong. Took 10 years to prove it. Eleanor was quiet, giving him space to continue or stop as he chose. In 1868, I got offered a contract. 3 weeks in Wyoming hunting elk for a settlement that had run low on meat. The pay was $200. That was a fortune then. Enough to buy more land, give Rose a better future. His hands tightened on the photograph. I told Margaret I would be back before Christmas. I told Rose I would bring her a present from the mountains, a doll I had carved during the long nights around the campfire. The cabin was silent except for the crackle of the fire. 3 weeks turned into 5. A blizzard trapped us in the high country, blocked all the passes. By the time we dug our way out and I made it back to Millbrook, everything had changed. Eleanor saw his jaw clench, saw the way his eyes went distant. People looked at me with pity. Some wouldn't look at me at all. That's how I knew something was wrong. You could feel it in the air, heavy as smoke. He set the photograph back on the mantel with careful precision. Scarlet fever had swept through while I was gone, killed dozens in less than a month. Margaret died on the 3rd day. Rose held on for almost a week, calling for her papa, asking when I was coming home. His voice cracked on the last word. They buried them together in the cemetery outside town. I never got to say goodbye. Never got to hold their hands while they passed, never got to tell them I loved them one last time. Eleanor reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. The gesture was tentative, unsure, but steady. You couldn't have known. But I should have been there. He turned to face her, and she saw the raw guilt that had lived in him for 6 years. That's what I can't forgive. Not the fever, not fate, myself, for choosing money over time, for thinking there would always be another Christmas, another chance. Is that why you came here to the mountain? Garrett nodded. I couldn't bear to be around people anymore. Every happy family was a knife in my chest. Every child's laugh reminded me of Rose. So I came up here to this cabin I had built years before and decided to stay until I died. He moved to the window, looking out at the forest that had been his prison and sanctuary. I told myself I was doing penance, that I deserved to suffer, that if I just punished myself enough, maybe it would balance the scales somehow. Eleanor came to stand beside him. She was half a foot taller, but in that moment the difference didn't matter. And now? Now I don't know. He looked up at her. You showed up at my clearing bleeding and bound, and for the first time in 6 years I cared whether someone lived or died. That terrifies me more than Clayton Marsh and all his men combined. The confession hung between them, honest and raw. Eleanor's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with surprising ease. I'm glad you cared. Even if it gets us both killed. Even then. She squeezed his hand. I spent 12 years believing I didn't deserve kindness, that I was too broken, too wrong, too much. You showed me that was a lie. If I die tomorrow, at least I'll die knowing someone saw me as human. Garrett turned his hand over palm to palm with hers. Her hand was larger, stronger, but it fit against his like it had been made for that purpose. You're more than human, Eleanor. You're extraordinary. The words seemed to steal her breath. She stared at him, searching for mockery or pity, finding neither. Just honest admiration from a man who had forgotten how to feel anything at all. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything. They stood like that as the sun rose higher, hands clasped something fragile and precious growing in the space between them. The danger outside remained. The men in the forest were still waiting. But for this moment, none of it mattered. For this moment, they were just two people who had found each other in the wilderness and decided to hold on. The spell broke when Garrett heard something that didn't belong, the crack of a branch, too loud to be an animal, too deliberate to be wind. He was at the rifle in 2 steps, Eleanor right behind him. How many? She whispered. Garrett scanned the tree line with practiced eyes. Movement flickered at the edge of his vision. 3 shapes, maybe 4, using the forest for cover. At least 3, could be more. Eleanor picked up the Winchester with hands that were steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. What do we do? Before Garrett could answer, a voice called out from the forest. Clayton Marsh, his tone conversational, almost friendly. Blackwell, I know you're in there. I want to talk. Garrett positioned himself behind the window frame, rifle ready. Then talk from where you are. This doesn't have to get bloody. Send out the woman and we ride away. You never see us again. Not going to happen. A pause, then Clayton's voice again, harder now. You're protecting a criminal, Blackwell. That woman stole $300 and assaulted a man of God. There's a legal bounty on her head. Eleanor's face went pale, but she didn't move from her position. Garrett's response was calm, matter of fact. I know about Crane. I know what he tried to do. That bounty's horseshit, and you know it." Another pause. When Clayton spoke again, calculation replaced anger. $500. That's what I'm authorized to offer you. Forget the bounty. This is a straight payment for not interfering. $500 for one woman. That's a fortune, Blackwell. More money than you'll see in 5 years up here." Garrett didn't hesitate. "The answer's no. Think about it. Winter's coming. You could use that money, buy supplies, livestock, whatever you need. All you have to do is step aside." I said no. The silence that followed was different, heavier. Garrett knew what it meant. Negotiation was over. Now came violence. "You're making a mistake, old man." Clayton's voice had gone cold. "I've got 6 men out here. You've got, what, 1 rifle and a scared woman. How long do you think you can hold out?" 6 men. Garrett's gut clenched. That was twice what he had estimated. The odds had just gotten substantially worse. Eleanor heard it too. She looked at him, the question clear in her eyes. Garrett made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. "Back door, now." "What? We can't hold this position against 6 men? We need to move." He was already grabbing his pack, shoving ammunition and supplies into it with practiced speed. "There's a place I know, higher up the mountain. They'll never find us there." Eleanor shouldered the pack he thrust at her. "How far?" 2 days' hard climb." He met her eyes. "Can you make it?" She nodded, jaw set with determination. Garrett cracked the back door and scanned the clearing. No movement yet. They had maybe 2 minutes before Clayton's men surrounded the cabin completely. "Stay low. Follow my path exactly. Don't look back." They moved. The forest swallowed them within seconds, pine branches closing overhead like a curtain. Behind them, Garrett heard shouting as Clayton's men realized their targets were running. Then came the sharp crack of rifle fire bullets tearing through the trees. Garrett grabbed Eleanor's hand and pulled her down a steep embankment. They slid the last 10 feet, landing in a creek bed that cut through the mountain like a scar. Ice-cold water soaked through their boots, but Garrett didn't stop. He ran upstream, knowing the water would hide their tracks. More gunfire. Closer now. They ran. Eleanor's longer legs ate up ground faster than Garrett's, and she had to slow herself to keep pace. Her breath came in white clouds, her heart hammering against her ribs. Fear warred with exhilaration. She was running toward something instead of away from it, running with someone instead of alone. It made all the difference. Garrett led them out of the creek and up a game trail so steep they had to use roots and rocks to pull themselves forward. Behind them the sounds of pursuit grew fainter but didn't disappear. Clayton's men were good, but they didn't know this mountain like Garrett did. He had spent 6 years learning every path, every shortcut, every hiding place. That knowledge would keep them alive. If they moved fast enough, they climbed for 2 hours without stopping. The temperature dropped as they gained elevation, and snow began to fall in earnest. Fat flakes that stuck to their hair and clothes, obscuring visibility, covering their tracks. Eleanor's lungs burned with the effort of breathing thin air. Her thighs screamed in protest. But she didn't ask to stop, didn't complain, just kept climbing, trusting Garrett to lead them somewhere safe. Finally, when the sun was high overhead but hidden behind clouds, Garrett stopped at a rock outcropping. He pulled Eleanor under the overhang, and they crouched there listening. No sounds of pursuit. The snow was falling hard enough now to muffle everything. "Are we safe?" Eleanor whispered. "For now." Garrett pulled out his canteen and handed it to her. "Drink. Small sips." She drank, and the water was shockingly cold, glacier melt from higher up. It cut through the burning in her throat, settling her racing heart. "Where are we going?" "There's an old trapper's cabin about 8 miles north. Built it myself 12 years ago when I was still guiding hunters. Nobody knows about it except me." 8 miles. Eleanor looked at the steep terrain ahead of them. "In this snow." "We'll make it." He met her eyes. "I've done harder climbs in worse weather." "Alone?" "Alone," he confirmed. Then added quietly, "But I'm glad I'm not alone now." The simple admission made Eleanor's chest tighten. She reached out and touched his face, her cold fingers against his bearded cheek. Garrett leaned into the touch for just a moment, allowing himself that small comfort. Then he pulled away and stood. "We need to keep moving. They'll be searching a grid pattern. Once they realize we're not at the cabin, they'll expand the search." They climbed. The terrain grew increasingly brutal. Sheer rock faces that required careful handholds, narrow ledges where one misstep meant falling hundreds of feet, snow that hid holes and weak spots, turning every step into a gamble. Eleanor's strength became their salvation. When Garrett's foot slipped on an icy rock, she caught him one-handed, holding his entire weight until he found purchase again. When they encountered a fallen tree too heavy for him to move, she lifted it aside like it was a branch. They worked together with the efficiency of people who had learned to trust each other through necessity. No wasted words, no hesitation, just movement and breath and the shared determination to survive. Night fell when they were still 2 miles from the cabin. Garrett found a small cave, barely more than a hollow under a boulder, and they crawled inside. It was cramped, barely big enough for both of them, but it blocked the wind and kept the snow off. Garrett built a tiny fire using pine needles and dry bark he had stored in his pack. The flames gave more light than heat, but even that small comfort made a difference. They sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing body warmth, watching snow fall past the cave entrance. "Tell me about the convent." Garrett's voice was quiet. "Not the bad parts. Something else." Eleanor was silent for a moment, surprised by the question. Nobody had ever asked her about anything good from that time. "There was a garden," she said finally, "behind the chapel. Sister Mary Catherine tended it. She was ancient, bent double with age, but she could make anything grow." A small smile touched Eleanor's lips at the memory. "She taught me the names of all the plants, which ones were for healing, which for cooking, which just for beauty. She said God made beauty for its own sake, sometimes not because it was useful, just because the world needed something lovely to look at." Sounds like a wise woman. "She was the only one who was kind to me. The other sisters saw me as a problem to be fixed, but Sister Mary Catherine said I was exactly what God intended. She said strength was a gift, not a curse, and that someday I would understand why I was made the way I was." Eleanor pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "She died when I was 20, peaceful in her sleep, surrounded by the flowers she had grown. I dug her grave myself, made it deep and lined it with stones so nothing would disturb her, planted wildflower seeds on top. I bet they grew beautiful." "They did." Eleanor's voice was soft. "Every spring that grave was covered in color. The other sisters said it was a sign of God's favor. I think it was just Sister Mary Catherine's gift continuing even after she was gone." Garrett added another stick to the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. "My daughter loved flowers too, wildflowers especially. She used to bring me fistfuls of them, all crushed from her tight grip, so proud of herself." He stared into the flames, seeing the past. "The spring after she died, wildflowers grew all over her grave. I couldn't visit. Couldn't stand to see that small plot of earth and know she was underneath it. But people told me, said it was the most beautiful grave in the cemetery." Eleanor reached out and took his hand. Garrett gripped it tight, grateful for the anchor. "Do you think they're together? Sister Mary Catherine and Rose, somewhere peaceful?" "I hope so." Garrett's voice was rough. "I hope there's a garden there, and an old woman teaching a little girl the names of flowers." They sat in silence after that, hands clasped, watching the fire burn down to embers. When sleep finally came, they stayed close, sharing warmth against the mountain cold. And in the darkness of the cave, with danger still hunting them, and the future uncertain, they found something neither had expected: peace. The second day of climbing was worse than the first. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had dropped well below freezing. Every breath stabbed like knives. Every step was an exercise in willpower. Garrett's age began to show. He tried to hide it, but Eleanor could see him favoring his right knee, could hear the rasp in his breathing. 6 years of solitary living had kept him lean and hard, but 35 was 35. The body didn't lie. Eleanor took the lead-breaking trail through snow that came up to her knees. Her height meant she could move faster through the drifts, and her strength meant she didn't tire as quickly. Garrett followed in her wake, conserving energy for when they would need it. They reached the cabin 3 hours past noon. It sat in a small clearing 10,000 feet up, surrounded by twisted pines that had learned to grow sideways to escape the wind. The structure was barely bigger than Garrett's lower cabin, but it was solid built to withstand the brutal winters this high. Garrett pushed open the door, and they stumbled inside. The interior was freezing but dry. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Rough-cut shelves held supplies in airtight containers. The bed was a simple wooden frame with rope supports designed to hold a mattress of pine needles or furs. Most importantly, there was no sign anyone had been here in years. "We're safe." Eleanor's voice was hoarse from breathing cold air. "As safe as we can be." Garrett dropped his pack and immediately began building a fire. "Clayton and his men won't make it this high. Not with winter coming. They'd be committing suicide." The fire caught and grew, driving back the cold inch by inch. Eleanor sank down beside it, her body finally allowing itself to feel the exhaustion it had been holding at bay. Garrett pulled dried meat and hardtack from the supply shelves. Not much, but enough to keep them alive for a few weeks if they were careful. He filled a pot with snow and set it to melt over the fire. They ate in silence, too tired for conversation. After the meal, Garrett stood and pulled more supplies from the shelves: blankets, furs, extra rope. His movements were automatic, practiced the ritual of survival he had performed countless times. Eleanor watched him and felt something shift in her chest. This man had risked everything for her, had abandoned his home, his safety, his careful isolation, had climbed into the high country in early winter with minimal supplies and no guarantee they would survive. All for a woman he had known less than a week. Garrett. He turned at the sound of his name. "Why are you doing this? Really?" He was quiet for a long moment, holding a bundle of furs in his arms. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 6 years of guilt and grief. "Because 6 years ago I wasn't there when the people I loved needed me. I told myself it was because I didn't know, because I couldn't have predicted the fever, because it wasn't my fault." He set the furs down carefully. "But the truth is, I chose wrong. I chose money over time. I chose my pride as a provider over being present. And they died asking where I was." He met Eleanor's eyes across the small space. "I swore I would never make that choice again, that if I ever cared about someone I would be there, no matter what it cost." Eleanor stood, and the small cabin suddenly felt even smaller with her full height. "You care about me?" It wasn't a question, but Garrett answered anyway. "Yes." The word hung between them, simple and profound. Eleanor crossed the space in 2 steps. She stood before him, looking down into his weathered face, seeing the truth written there: fear, hope, the terrible vulnerability of caring about someone when caring meant the possibility of loss. "I care about you too." Her voice was barely a whisper. "That terrifies me." "Why?" "Because everyone I've ever cared about has left. My parents sent me away. Sister Mary Catherine died. Patrick used me and disappeared. I learned that caring about people just meant giving them the power to hurt you." Garrett reached up and placed his hand on her face, his calloused palm rough against her cheek. "I'm not them." "How do I know that?" "You don't." His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. "You just have to decide if the risk is worth it." Eleanor closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. When she opened them again, something had been decided. "Teach me how to risk again." Garrett's breath caught. "Eleanor, I haven't been with anyone since Margaret died. I don't know if I can." "Then we'll learn together." She knelt, bringing herself down to his eye level. Her hands framed his face, gentle despite their strength. "I need you to know something first." Her voice was steady, but he could see vulnerability in her eyes. "At the convent there was a man, Patrick, the groundskeeper." Garrett went very still. "He came to my room at night. The sisters knew. They didn't care as long as I kept working. He taught me things. about my body, about pleasure, about what men want from women. Her hands tightened slightly. Then one day he was gone. I found out later that Reverend Crane had paid him to keep me docile to make sure I wouldn't cause trouble. Everything he made me feel was bought. Everything he told me was a lie. Garrett saw the pain in her eyes and understood. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Eleanor leaned her forehead against his. Just be different. Be real. I don't need pretty words or false promises. I just need you to be honest. I can do that. Garrett's hands found her waist. The truth is, I'm terrified. Terrified that I'll forget Margaret's face if I let myself feel something for you. Terrified that I'll fail you the way I failed her. Terrified that caring about you means I'll lose you too. Those are valid fears, but not enough to make me walk away. He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. Is that honest enough? Eleanor smiled, and it transformed her face. That's honest enough. She kissed him. The kiss was tentative at first, a question being asked and answered. Then it deepened 6 years of loneliness, meeting 12 years of isolation. Garrett's hands tightened on her waist, feeling the strength in her body, the warmth of her through layers of cloth. Eleanor's hands slid into his hair, and she made a sound low in her throat that sent heat through him despite the cold. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. The bed, Eleanor said. We should... Yes. They moved together to the simple wooden frame. Eleanor spread the furs over the rope supports, creating a nest of warmth. Garrett added wood to the fire until it blazed, driving back the cold. Then they came together again, and Eleanor took charge with the confidence of someone who knew her own body and wasn't ashamed of it. Let me show you, she whispered against his mouth. Let me teach you what I need. Garrett nodded, surrendering control to her, trusting her to guide him. Eleanor's hands moved with purpose, removing layers of clothing, exposing skin to firelight and each other's touch. When Garrett hesitated, uncertain, she took his hands and placed them where she wanted them. Here, she said, like this. She taught him the geography of her body, the places that made her gasp, the rhythm she needed, the pressure, the angle, the patience required. Garrett learned with the focus he brought to tracking animals and reading weather patterns. He memorized what made her breath catch, what made her arch against him, what made her whisper his name like a prayer. When she finally pulled him over her, fitting their bodies together with gentle insistence, Garrett felt something break open inside him. Not just physical release, though, that came later. Something deeper. The wall he had built around his heart brick by brick over 6 years cracked and crumbled. He was alive, not just surviving, but living. For the first time since Margaret died, he wanted to see tomorrow. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the furs, skin to skin, sharing warmth. Eleanor's head rested on Garrett's chest, rising and falling with his breathing. His arm was around her shoulders, holding her close. "Thank you," he said quietly. Eleanor lifted her head to look at him. "For what?" "For bringing me back." She kissed him softly. "Thank you for being willing to come back." Outside, wind howled around the cabin and snow began to fall again. Winter was coming in earnest now, and they were trapped high on the mountain with minimal supplies and no way down until spring. They should have been terrified. Instead, Eleanor felt safer than she had in 12 years, and Garrett felt more at peace than he had in 6. They had each other. For now, that was enough. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that felt almost normal. They woke together tangled in furs and lay listening to the wind. Garrett would rise first, rebuild the fire-melt snow for water. Eleanor would join him, and they would eat a sparse breakfast of dried meat and the last of the hardtack. Then they would work. Garrett taught Eleanor how to set snares for rabbits and ptarmigan, how to read the weather in the color of the sky, how to move through deep snow without exhausting yourself. Eleanor proved to be an apt student, her natural strength combined with quick intelligence, making her better at mountain survival than most men Garrett had guided. The trap lines they set were successful. Rabbit. Marten. Once a lynx that Garrett shot cleanly with the sharps. The pelts would be worth good money come spring. if they lived that long. The supplies from the cabin ran low faster than Garrett had anticipated. He had planned for one person surviving one winter. 2 people ate twice as much. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. By the 3rd week they were rationing carefully. 1 meal a day. Small portions, supplemented by whatever they could trap, but game was scarce this high. Eleanor noticed Garrett giving her larger portions, taking less for himself. She called him on it. "We split everything evenly. You're bigger. You need more. You're older. You need just as much." She pushed half of her portion back to his side of the plate. "We share, or I don't eat at all." Garrett looked at her stubborn face and felt something warm bloom in his chest. Not desire, though that was there too. Something deeper. The realization that she would protect him as fiercely as he protected her. Partnership. Equality. The kind of relationship he had shared with Margaret. "All right," he said. "We share." The nights were the best part. After the work was done and the fire was built high, they would lie together in the nest of furs and talk. About everything and nothing. About the lives they had lived before they found each other. Garrett told her about guiding hunters through the mountains, about the time he had tracked a wounded grizzly for 3 days to put it out of its misery, about learning to read the land the way other men read books. Eleanor told him about the other girls at St. Agnes, the ones who didn't survive their cures, the graves she had dug with her own hands, knowing the sisters would forget those names within a week. They shared their pain and found it lighter for being divided between 2. And when words ran out, they found other ways to communicate. Eleanor continued to teach Garrett the language of bodies, what she liked, what she needed. But slowly, as trust deepened, Garrett began to teach her something too. Gentleness. The idea that touch could be soft as well as urgent, that pleasure didn't have to be taken but could be given freely. Patrick had taught her mechanics. Garrett taught her tenderness. The difference mattered more than she could have imagined. One night, as they lay wrapped in each other, Eleanor spoke into the darkness. "What happens in the spring?" Garrett was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to happen?" "I don't know." She traced patterns on his chest with her finger. "I have $300 hidden at the lower cabin. My inheritance. If we make it back down, I could go anywhere. Denver, San Francisco, somewhere big enough that nobody would look twice at a woman my size." "Is that what you want?" "A city." Eleanor thought about it honestly. 2 months ago I would have said yes. Somewhere I could disappear. Somewhere I could be anonymous. And now I'm not sure disappearing is what I want anymore. She lifted herself up on one elbow to look at him in the firelight. "What about you? Will you go back to your cabin? Back to being alone?" Garrett reached up and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "I don't think I can go back to being alone, not after this." "What does that mean?" He took a breath, gathering courage. "It means when we get down from this mountain, when Abraham clears your name and Crane is dealt with, I want you to stay. Not as someone passing through, not as someone I helped, as my partner, my equal." His hand cupped her face. "My wife, if you'll have me." Eleanor's breath caught. "Garrett, we barely know each other. I know enough. I know you're strong and brave and good. I know you make me want to see tomorrow instead of just surviving today. I know that whatever time we have left, I want to spend it with you." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes. "I'm not an easy person to be with. I'm too big, too different. People will talk. They'll judge you for choosing someone like me." "Let them talk." Garrett's voice was fierce. "I've spent 6 years listening to my own judgment. I'm done caring what anyone else thinks." Eleanor kissed him, tasting salt from her own tears. "Yes," she whispered against his mouth. "If we survive this, if we make it down. Yes." Garrett pulled her close, holding tight to this fragile promise of a future. Outside, the wind howled and snow piled higher. But inside the cabin, wrapped in furs and each other's arms, 2 people who had been broken by life began to believe in the possibility of being whole. The 5th week brought disaster. Garrett woke to a sound that didn't belong. Not wind, not animals. Something deeper, A rumble that seemed to come from the mountain itself. He was on his feet before he was fully conscious, instinct overriding thought. Eleanor, get up now. She woke instantly, warrior reflexes honed by 12 years of survival. What is it? The rumble grew louder. The cabin began to shake. Avalanche. The word had barely left his mouth when the world exploded into motion. The wall of snow hit the cabin like the fist of God. Timber groaned and cracked. The roof buckled inward. Garrett grabbed Eleanor and pulled her toward the fireplace, the only structure solid enough to survive. They made it halfway before the beam came down. 100 pounds of pine timber driven by tons of snow caught Eleanor across the shoulders and drove her to the ground. She hit hard, her head cracking against the stone floor. Blood bloomed instantly dark against her pale skin. Then she went still. Eleanor! Garrett's scream was swallowed by the roar of the avalanche. Snow poured through the shattered roof, filling the cabin, burying everything. He threw himself over Eleanor's body, using his own weight to protect her from the cascading white death. It seemed to last forever. The roar, the cold, the crushing weight. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Silence. Garrett lay in complete darkness, buried under snow, his lungs screaming for air. He clawed upward, fighting panic, breaking through to find himself in a pocket of air created by the collapsed roof. Gray light filtered through cracks in the debris. He could breathe. He was alive. Eleanor. He dug with his bare hands, throwing snow aside with desperate strength. Found her arm, her shoulder, her head. She wasn't breathing. No, 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 no. Garrett's hands shook as he felt for a pulse, found it weak and thready. She was alive but unconscious, blood still flowing from the wound on her head. He had to get her out. The beam across her back was too heavy for him to lift alone. He used a broken piece of timber as a lever, wedging it under the beam, using his full weight to pry it up inch by agonizing inch. When he had enough space, he grabbed Eleanor under the arms and pulled. Her dead weight fought him, but fear gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. He got her free and dragged her to the one corner of the cabin that still had solid walls. The fireplace had survived its stone structure intact. He cleared snow away and laid Eleanor down as gently as he could. Then he went to work. First stopped the bleeding. He tore strips from his shirt and pressed them against the wound on her head. The cut was deep but clean. Scalp wounds bled like hell but usually weren't fatal. Usually. Second check for other injuries. He ran his hands over her body, feeling for breaks or punctures. Her left shoulder was dislocated, the joint sitting wrong. He would have to set it, and it would hurt like hell. Third warmth. The temperature was dropping fast with the roof gone. He found his pack miraculously intact and pulled out the emergency supplies he always carried. Flint and steel. Tinder. Within minutes he had a small fire going in the fireplace. Eleanor moaned the first sound she had made. Her eyes fluttered, but didn't open. "That's it," Garrett murmured, his hands gentle on her face. "Come back to me. Don't you dare leave." He pulled furs from the wreckage and wrapped her in them. Her skin was too cold, her breathing too shallow. The head wound had stopped bleeding, but she needed to wake up, needed to drink, needed to show him she was going to survive this. Night fell. The temperature plummeted. Garrett kept the fire going and talked to Eleanor, telling her stories about Margaret and Rose, about his years in the mountains, about the future they had planned, telling her all the things he had never said to Margaret before she died. The second day, Eleanor's fever started. It came on fast, her skin going from cold to burning in a matter of hours. She thrashed in her sleep, crying out in languages Garrett didn't understand. Sometimes English, sometimes something else musical and harsh at the same time. Shoshone, he realized, her mother's tongue. He cooled her with snow-forced water between her lips, prayed to a god he had stopped believing in 6 years ago. The third day, she stopped breathing. Garrett's hands moved before his mind could catch up. He tilted her head back, pinched her nose, and breathed into her mouth. Once, twice, 3 times. Her chest rose and fell with his breath, but didn't continue on its own. He pressed on her sternum, counting compressions the way a doctor had once shown him. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. 30 more. "Don't you dare!" he screamed at her unconscious face. "Don't you dare leave me. Not after everything. Not now. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. I love you. Do you hear me? I love you. And you don't get to die until you hear me say it while you're awake. 30 compressions, 2 breaths." Eleanor gasped, coughed, breathed. Garrett collapsed beside her, sobbing like he hadn't sobbed since Rose's funeral. Great heaving sobs that came from somewhere primal and terrified and grateful. She was alive. She was breathing. She had come back. On the 4th day, Eleanor's eyes opened. Garrett was dozing beside her, exhausted beyond measure, when he felt her hand move. His eyes snapped open to find her looking at him with unfocused eyes. "Garrett." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here." He took her hand, holding it like a lifeline. "I'm right here." "What happened?" "Avalanche. Hit the cabin. You were trapped." Eleanor's eyes moved, taking in the destroyed structure, the makeshift shelter, the haunted look on Garrett's face. "You stayed." "Of course I stayed." His voice was rough. "Where else would I go?" A tear slid down her cheek. "Everyone else leaves." "I'm not everyone else." He leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "I promised I would be here. I keep my promises now." Eleanor's hand tightened on his. "I heard you when I was somewhere else. I heard you screaming at me not to leave. You remember that I remember everything." She looked at him with eyes that saw too much. "You said you loved me." Garrett didn't hesitate. "I do. Even though we've only known each other 5 weeks. I knew after 5 days. The rest was just me being too afraid to admit it." Eleanor tried to smile, but pain creased her face. "My shoulder. Dislocated. I need to set it. It's going to hurt." "Do it." Garrett positioned himself carefully, one hand on her shoulder, the other on her arm. "On 3. 1. He pulled on 2 before she could tense up. The joint popped back into place with a sound that made them both wince. Eleanor's scream echoed off the broken walls. Then she sagged back, breathing hard, tears streaming down her face. "You're a bastard," she gasped. "I know." He wiped her face gently. "But the shoulder's back in." "How long was I out?" 4 days. Eleanor's eyes widened. "For Garrett, we need to get down the mountain. We don't have enough supplies." "We will. You need to recover first." "We don't have time for me to recover." She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, her face going gray with pain. Garrett pushed her back down. "We have enough time. I've been rationing. We can last another week, maybe 2 if we're careful." "And then we climb down, together." He met her eyes. "I'm not losing you to the mountain. Not after I almost lost you to the avalanche." Eleanor reached up and touched his face, feeling the days of stubble, the lines of exhaustion, the love written plain for anyone to see. "I'm not going anywhere without you. Promise?" "I promise." Garrett kissed her palm, then pulled the furs up around her shoulders. "Rest now. We'll figure out the rest later." Eleanor's eyes drifted closed, exhaustion pulling her back under, but her hand stayed in Garrett's, an anchor between them. Outside, winter deepened its grip on the mountain. Inside the ruined cabin, 2 people held on to each other and the fragile promise of tomorrow. They had survived the avalanche. Now they just had to survive everything that came after. Eleanor recovered slowly. Too slowly for Garrett's comfort, but faster than he had dared hope. By the end of the 1st week after the avalanche, she could sit up without the world spinning. By the end of the 2nd, she could stand and walk short distances. But they had lost everything in the avalanche. The furs they had trapped so carefully. The supplies Garrett had cached in the cabin. Even the Sharp's rifle was buried somewhere under tons of snow and broken timber. All they had left were the clothes on their backs, the Winchester Eleanor had been sleeping beside Garrett's knife, and enough dried meat for maybe 3 more days if they were careful. They couldn't stay. The mountain would kill them before spring. On the 14th day after the avalanche, Garrett helped Eleanor to the edge of the clearing. The descent route stretched before them, a nightmare of steep switchbacks and exposed cliff faces, all covered in ice and snow. "Can you make it?" He already knew the answer, but he had to ask. Eleanor looked at the path they would have to take and felt her stomach clench. Her head still ached. Her shoulder, though set properly, screamed whenever she moved it wrong. The simple act of walking 20 feet had left her breathing hard, but staying meant dying. The choice was that simple. "I'll make it." She met his eyes. "I didn't survive 12 years at St. Agnes and an avalanche just to freeze to death on a mountain." Garrett nodded and pulled rope from his pack. He tied one end around Eleanor's waist and the other around his own, leaving 20 feet of slack between them. "If you slip, I'll catch you. If I slip, you brace and hold. Understand?" "I understand." They began to descend. The first day was hell. Every step required focus. Every handhold had to be tested. The rope between them grew taut and slack as they navigated the treacherous terrain, each taking turns, being anchor and climber. Eleanor's strength, even diminished by injury, saved them more than once. When Garrett's foot slipped on black ice and he started to slide, Eleanor braced herself and held the rope, arresting his fall before he could pick up speed. When they encountered a section too steep to climb down, Eleanor lowered Garrett on the rope, then rappelled down after him, using her upper body strength to control the descent. They made camp that night in a shallow cave, huddled together for warmth with no fire. Garrett had used the last of his tinder the day before, and everything around them was too wet to burn. Eleanor shivered against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, trying to share what little warmth his body could produce. "Tell me about the future," she whispered into the darkness. "The one we planned before the avalanche." Garrett's voice was rough from cold and exhaustion. "We get down this mountain. We go to Abraham and he clears your name. We take your inheritance and buy land near Silver Ridge. Build a real house, not a cabin, big enough that you don't have to duck through doorways." Despite everything, Eleanor smiled. "We'll have a garden. You can grow all the flowers Sister Mary Catherine taught you about. We'll raise horses, maybe cattle, live quiet and build something that lasts." "Children," her voice was barely audible. Garrett's arms tightened around her. "If you want them." "I want them. Want to give them the childhood I never had, where being different is celebrated instead of punished." "Then we'll give them that." He kissed the top of her head. "But first we have to get off this mountain." The second day brought new challenges. The rope between them frayed on sharp rock, forcing Garrett to cut away the damaged section and retie the knots, shortening their safety margin. Eleanor's shoulder started bleeding again where the dislocation had torn muscle, and the temperature dropped even further as a new storm system moved in. But they kept moving, one step at a time, one handhold after another, refusing to quit because quitting meant dying, and they had too much to live for now. On the third day, when Garrett's hands were bleeding from gripping frozen rock and Eleanor could barely lift her injured arm, they heard something that made them both freeze. Voices, human voices, calling out in the distance below them. Garrett peered over the edge of the cliff they were descending and saw movement in the trees. Men on horseback searching the area in a grid pattern. Clayton Marsh and his men, still hunting. "They're still here," Eleanor breathed. "After all this time. Crane must be paying them well." Garrett pulled back from the edge. "We need to get down fast, before they expand their search pattern to this altitude." They moved faster, taking risks they shouldn't have taken, driven by desperation. When they were still 1,000 feet up, Eleanor's injured shoulder finally gave out. Her hand slipped from a crucial hold and she started to fall. The rope snapped taut. Garrett's shoulders screamed in protest as her full weight hit the line. He braced against the rock face, feet wedged in a crack, holding her suspended above a 100-foot drop. "I've got you," he shouted down. "Find a handhold." Eleanor swung in empty air, her good hand scrabbling against smooth rock. There, a tiny ledge barely enough for her fingertips. She caught it, got her feet under her, took the weight off the rope. Garrett sagged with relief. "You okay?" "My shoulder's done. I can't use it anymore." Her voice was steady despite the fear. "You're going to have to lower me the rest of the way." It took them 6 hours to descend the last 1,000 feet. 6 hours of Garrett lowering Eleanor 10 feet at a time, then climbing down to her position and repeating the process. His hands were raw meat by the time they reached level ground. Eleanor's face was gray with pain. But they had made it. They were off the mountain. They stumbled into Silver Ridge just after nightfall, looking like they had crawled out of hell, which in a sense they had. The town had grown since Garrett's last visit 6 years ago. 2 new buildings on Main Street, a proper church with a bell tower, more houses spreading out from the center. But the essentials remained the same: general store, saloon, and Abraham Porter's law office still occupying the same small building at the end of Main Street. Garrett led Eleanor to the office and pounded on the door. A light came on inside, and Abraham's voice called out wary, "Who's there?" "Garrett Blackwell. I need help." The door flew open. Abraham stood there in his nightshirt, a pistol in one hand, his face a picture of shock. "Blackwell, we thought you were dead. The whole town's been talking about the avalanche, and when you didn't come down—" He trailed off as he saw Eleanor. "Dear God, get inside. Both of you." They stumbled into the warmth of the office. Abraham's wife Mary appeared from the back room and immediately took charge, guiding Eleanor to a chair and examining her injuries with practiced efficiency. "This shoulder needs proper treatment, and this head wound could still get infected." She looked at her husband. "Get Dr. Morrison, now." Abraham nodded and grabbed his coat. Before he left, he turned to Garrett. "I have news about Crane. It's not good. Tell me." He filed a motion with Judge Harrison 2 weeks ago, claimed Eleanor was dead lost in the mountain during the avalanche, said as her closest creditor her inheritance should pass to him. Garrett felt his blood go cold. "When's the ruling?" "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Eleanor's head came up despite her exhaustion. "Tomorrow we have to be there." "You need rest," Mary protested. "You're in no condition to appear in court." "I don't have a choice." Eleanor's voice was steel. "If I don't show up, I lose everything, and Crane wins." Abraham looked between them, seeing the determination in their faces. "Then we'll make sure you're there. But there's something else you should know." "What?" "Crane's not alone. He's got 6 armed men staying at the hotel. They've been waiting, watching. If you show up at that courthouse tomorrow, there's a good chance they'll try to stop you." Garrett's jaw tightened. "Let them try." Dr. Morrison arrived within the hour, a graying man in his 60s who had seen every kind of injury the frontier could produce. He examined Eleanor with gentle hands, cleaned and restitched. Her head wound strapped her shoulder with a proper sling and gave her laudanum for the pain. "You should be in bed for a week," he said bluntly. "But I have a feeling you're not going to listen to me." "I'll rest after tomorrow." Eleanor's eyes were already drooping from the laudanum. Morrison nodded and turned to Garrett. "And you. Those hands need treatment before infection sets in." He cleaned and bandaged Garrett's torn palms, gave him salve for the rope burns on his torso, and left strict instructions that Garrett ignored as soon as the doctor was out the door. Abraham returned with news that made Garrett's strategic mind start working. "I've gathered 12 men. People who've been hurt by Crane's business practices over the years. They're willing to stand with us tomorrow. Willing to fight, if it comes to that." Abraham's face was grim, "but I'm hoping it won't. If we can get Eleanor into that courthouse and in front of Judge Harrison, the law will protect us. Harrison may be influenced by Crane's money, but he won't commit murder in open court." "What about getting to the courthouse?" "That's where the men come in. We'll create a distraction. Keep Crane's thugs occupied while you and Eleanor slip in through the back entrance." It wasn't a great plan, but it was better than nothing. That night Garrett and Eleanor stayed in the small room above Abraham's office. It was the first time they had slept in a real bed since the avalanche. The first time they had been truly warm. The first time they could let their guard down even slightly. Eleanor lay on her good side and Garrett curled around her back, careful of her injuries. His bandaged hand rested on her hip. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. "Terrified," he admitted, "but not of Crane's men." of losing you now after everything we've been through." Eleanor turned her head to look at him over her shoulder. "You won't lose me. We've survived worse." "Have we?" "We survived each other's pain. That's harder than surviving bullets." Garrett kissed her shoulder. "When this is over, when Crane is dealt with and your name is clear, will you still want to marry me? A man almost twice your age who lives in a cabin on a mountain." Eleanor smiled. "Will you still want to marry me? A woman who's too big, too strong, and too damaged to fit anywhere civilized?" "More than anything." "Then yes, I'll still want to marry you." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, stealing these last moments of peace before the storm. Morning came too quickly. Garrett woke to find Abraham already in the office below, voices drifting up through the floorboards. He eased out of bed, careful not to wake Eleanor, and descended the stairs. Abraham stood with a group of 12 men ranging in age from early 20s to past 60. Farmers, miners, shopkeepers, all armed, all grim-faced. "This is everyone?" Garrett asked. Abraham nodded. "Sarah Whitfield is coordinating from the schoolhouse. She'll bring the women and children to the courthouse once we've secured it. Witnesses in case things go wrong." A man Garrett recognized as Dutch Anderson, the saloon owner, stepped forward. "We're not fighters, Blackwell, but we're all tired of Crane bleeding this town dry. If standing with you and Miss Wright means we get our town back, we'll stand." Garrett felt something loosen in his chest. These men were risking everything. For a woman they didn't know. For a principle that mattered more than safety. "Thank you," was all he could say. Eleanor appeared at the top of the stairs dressed in clean clothes Mary had provided. The dark blue dress made her look almost respectable despite the bandages visible at her temple and the sling supporting her arm. She descended carefully, and every man in the room looked up at her. Some faces showed surprise at her height. Others showed calculation, wondering if the stories about her strength were true. Sarah Whitfield entered through the back door, and Garrett saw Eleanor's posture change. Relax just slightly. Sarah was mixed race herself, black and white, teaching in a town that barely tolerated her presence. She and Eleanor recognized each other instantly as kindred spirits. "Miss Wright," Sarah's voice was cultured, educated. "I've heard about your situation. I want you to know that not everyone in Silver Ridge judges people by their appearance." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Sarah turned to the assembled men. "The women are ready. As soon as you give the signal, we'll fill that courthouse. Let's see Crane try something with 50 witnesses watching." The plan was simple. At 9:30, half the men would create a disturbance on Main Street, drawing Crane's hired guns out of position. At 9:45, Garrett and Eleanor would slip into the courthouse through the back entrance. At 10 o'clock, the hearing would begin, and the women would flood in, filling every seat, making violence impossible without mass slaughter. It should work. If everyone played their parts. If Crane's men took the bait. If Judge Harrison actually cared about the law more than Crane's bribes. Too many ifs. But it was all they had. At 9:15 they moved into position. Garrett led Eleanor through back alleys, keeping to shadows, avoiding the main street where Crane's men would be watching. His bandaged hands ached with every movement, but he ignored the pain. Eleanor followed, her injured shoulder held tight against her body, her face set with determination. They reached the back of the courthouse at 9:40. Through the walls they could hear raised voices from the street. The distraction had begun. Abraham appeared from a side door, his face flushed. "It's working. All 6 of Crane's men went to investigate. The courthouse is clear." They slipped inside through a servant's entrance and made their way to the courtroom. Judge Harrison was already at his bench, looking annoyed at the noise from outside. Crane sat at the plaintiff's table dressed in expensive clothes, his broken arm still in a sling from when Eleanor had pushed him months ago. He saw Eleanor enter, and his face went white. "Impossible," he breathed. "You're dead." "Disappointed," Eleanor's voice carried across the courtroom. The judge's gavel cracked down. "Order, Miss Wright, you are indeed alive. This changes the nature of the proceedings considerably." "It changes nothing." Crane was on his feet. "This woman is a criminal, a thief and an assailant. She should be arrested, not given a hearing. She should be heard, Your Honor." Abraham moved to stand beside Eleanor. "I have evidence that proves the charges against Miss Wright are false, evidence that shows Reverend Crane has been trafficking women from St. Agnes Convent for over a decade. The courtroom erupted. Crane's face went from white to red. Lies, all lies. This is a conspiracy to defame a man of God. Abraham pulled a folder from his bag and handed it to the judge. Letters, Your Honor. Correspondence between Reverend Crane and the Mother Superior of St. Agnes. Discussing prices, discussing preferences, discussing delivery arrangements for women purchased from the convent. Judge Harrison's face darkened as he read. The courtroom fell silent except for the rustle of papers. Finally, the judge looked up. His voice was cold. Reverend Crane, these documents appear to show a pattern of human trafficking spanning 15 years. Do you deny writing these letters? Crane's lawyer stood. Your Honor, the provenance of these documents is questionable. They could be forgeries. They're not forgeries. A new voice spoke from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned to see a woman in a nun's habit standing in the doorway. She was ancient, bent with age, but her eyes were sharp as knives. Eleanor gasped. Sister Margaret. The old nun moved slowly down the aisle, leaning heavily on a cane. I am Sister Margaret Callahan, former Mother Superior of St. Agnes Convent. I wrote some of those letters. I sold women to wealthy men, including this one. She pointed at Crane with her cane. I did it because the church paid me, because Reverend Crane paid me, because money mattered more than souls. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Judge Harrison's gavel cracked repeatedly, trying to restore order. Sister Margaret reached Eleanor and looked up at her with eyes full of regret. I came to ask forgiveness, and to tell the truth even if it damns me. Eleanor stared at the woman who had tormented her for 12 years, the woman who had approved every beating, every hour of forced labor, every humiliation. She should have felt rage, should have felt satisfaction at seeing her abuser brought low. Instead, she felt only pity. Why now? Eleanor asked quietly. Because I'm dying. Cancer, the doctors say. 3 months, maybe less. Sister Margaret's voice was steady. I spent 60 years serving God. I want to meet Him knowing I told the truth at the end. The judge cleared his throat. Sister Margaret, are you willing to testify under oath about these transactions? I am, Your Honor, though I suspect it will earn me hell rather than heaven. Eleanor reached down and took the old woman's hand. Sister Margaret flinched as if expecting violence. Instead, Eleanor squeezed gently. Thank you, Eleanor said, for being brave enough to tell the truth. Sister Margaret's eyes filled with tears. You were always stronger than the rest of us. I see that now. The hearing proceeded with methodical efficiency after that. Sister Margaret testified about the trafficking operation. Abraham presented financial records showing Crane had claimed debts that didn't exist. Eleanor told her story simply and without embellishment, describing 12 years of forced labor and Crane's attempt to purchase her. By noon, Judge Harrison had heard enough. I find in favor of Eleanor Wright. The inheritance left by her uncle is legally hers. Reverend Josiah Crane's claim is dismissed with prejudice. The courtroom erupted in applause. Eleanor sagged with relief, and Garrett caught her before she could fall. But Crane wasn't finished. He stood, his face twisted with rage and desperation. This isn't over. That money belongs to me. I need it. You don't understand. What don't we understand, Reverend? The judge's voice was ice, and then Crane broke. The careful facade cracked, and the desperate man underneath spilled out. My son. My boy died in one of my mines, 18 years old, working a 16-hour shift because I was too greedy to hire enough men. Tears streamed down his face. The family sued. They won. I owe $30,000. The inheritance was supposed to cover it, was supposed to make it right. The courtroom fell silent. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, rage giving way to something more complex. You tried to buy me to pay for your son's death. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. Crane looked at her with eyes full of anguish. I needed the money. I thought if I could pay the families, it would balance the scales. It would mean something. It would have meant nothing. Eleanor's voice was firm. Your son died because of your choices. Buying me wouldn't change that. It would just add another victim to the list. Crane collapsed into his chair, the fight gone out of him. Judge Harrison spoke into the silence. "Josiah Crane, you are under arrest for human trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy. Sheriff, take him into custody." As the sheriff led Crane away, the man looked back at Eleanor one last time. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." Eleanor nodded. She didn't forgive him, but she understood that broken people sometimes broke others in their desperation to be whole. The courtroom emptied slowly. Sarah Whitfield approached with the other women who had come as witnesses. "You won," Sarah said simply. "We won," Eleanor corrected. "All of us." Outside the courthouse, the men who had stood guard cheered when Garrett and Eleanor emerged. Dutch Anderson produced a bottle of whiskey, and someone started playing a fiddle. Impromptu celebration broke out in the street. Abraham pulled Garrett aside. "The inheritance is yours now, $12,000. What will you do with it?" Garrett looked at Eleanor, who was surrounded by women congratulating her, asking her questions, treating her like she belonged. "We're going to build something," he said. "A school. A place where any child can learn. White Indian mixed. Doesn't matter. A place where being different is celebrated instead of punished." Abraham smiled. "She's good for you. You know that." "I know." Garrett watched Eleanor laugh at something Sarah said. "She's the best thing that's happened to me in 6 years." "Then don't waste it." Abraham clapped him on the shoulder. "Life's too short for hesitation." That evening, as the celebration died down, Garrett found Eleanor sitting on the steps of the church, looking at the mountains in the distance. He sat beside her, their shoulders touching. "It's over," she said quietly. "The legal part is, but there's still one thing we need to do." Eleanor turned to look at him. "What's that?" Garrett stood and held out his hand. "Marry me. Not someday, not when everything is perfect, now, tomorrow, as soon as we can find someone to perform the ceremony." Eleanor stared at him. "Garrett, we have money now. We could go anywhere. Denver, San Francisco. You could have time to think about this." "I don't need time. I need you." He pulled her to her feet. "I spent 6 years thinking. I'm done thinking. I want to live." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared. What if I'm not good enough? What if I can't be the wife you need? You're already everything I need. You're strong when I'm weak. You're brave when I'm afraid. You make me want to see tomorrow." He cupped her face in his bandaged hands. "Marry me, Eleanor Wright. Make me the happiest man in the territory." She kissed him then in front of the church, in front of anyone who cared to watch. A kiss that tasted of salt and hope and the future they were building together. When they finally broke apart, she was smiling. "Yes, tomorrow. I'll marry you tomorrow." Sister Margaret performed the ceremony. It was a strange choice perhaps for the woman who had caused Eleanor so much pain to be the one to marry her. But Eleanor had insisted. If Sister Margaret was brave enough to tell the truth and face the consequences, she deserved the chance at redemption. The ceremony took place in the town square 2 days later. 200 people attended, nearly the entire population of Silver Ridge. They came because they were curious about the giant woman and the hermit. They stayed because the love between Garrett and Eleanor was so obvious it made even the hardest hearts soften. Eleanor wore a simple white dress that Sarah and the other women had sewn in 2 days of frantic work. It was the first time in her life anything had been made specifically to fit her body. She stood straight and tall, no longer hunching to make herself smaller. Garrett wore his best clothes, which weren't very impressive by city standards, but were clean and mended with care. He had trimmed his beard and combed his hair, and he looked like a man who had found his way back from darkness. Sister Margaret stood before them leaning on her cane, her voice carrying across the square. "I have married hundreds of couples in my 60 years as a sister of the church. I married people to God, believing that was the highest calling." She looked at Eleanor and Garrett with eyes that had seen too much. "But today I marry 2 people to each other. Two people who were told they were too broken for love, too damaged for redemption, too different for acceptance. Her voice grew stronger. Eleanor Wright, you were told you were too big for heaven. Garrett Blackwell, you believed you were too broken for grace. But love doesn't measure size, and redemption doesn't count scars. Sister Margaret gestured for them to join hands. Do you, Garrett Blackwell, take Eleanor Wright to be your wife, to stand beside her in strength and weakness, to choose her every day, no matter what comes? Garrett's voice was steady. I do. Do you, Eleanor Wright, take Garrett Blackwell to be your husband, to stand beside him in joy and sorrow, to choose him every day, for as long as you both live? Eleanor's voice rang clear. I do. Then by the authority vested in me by the Catholic Church and the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife. Sister Margaret smiled, and it transformed her ancient face. Kiss your bride, Mr. Blackwell. Garrett had to stand on his toes to reach Eleanor's lips. She laughed and bent down, meeting him halfway. The kiss was chaste and sweet and perfect. The crowd erupted in cheers. At the reception in the town hall, Eleanor pulled Garrett aside during a quiet moment. Her hand rested on her stomach, and her eyes held a secret. I need to tell you something. Garrett's heart jumped. What? I'm pregnant. The world seemed to stop. Garrett stared at her, unable to process the words. You're certain? Mary Porter confirmed it yesterday. The doctor estimates 3 months along. It must have happened on the mountain before the avalanche. Garrett's eyes filled with tears. He pulled Eleanor close, holding her as gently as if she were made of glass. A baby, he whispered. We're going to have a baby. Are you happy? Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He looked up at her joy written across his face. I get to do it right this time. I get to be there. I get to watch our child grow. Eleanor kissed him. We'll do it right. Together. The months that followed were the happiest of Garrett Blackwell's life. They used Eleanor's inheritance to buy land just outside Silver Ridge. 20 acres with a stream running through it, good soil for crops, enough timber to build with. Garrett designed a house with door frames tall enough for Eleanor to walk through without ducking. The entire town helped with the construction, men and women working side by side, raising walls and setting beams. By spring, the house was finished. 2 stories, 4 bedrooms, a kitchen, big enough to feed a dozen people. It was more home than Garrett had ever imagined having again. Eleanor worked alongside the men until her pregnancy made it impossible to lift heavy timber. Then she focused on the garden, planting everything Sister Mary Catherine had taught her decades ago. Flowers mixed with vegetables, creating a riot of color and practicality. Garrett watched her work and marveled at how wrong everyone had been about her. She wasn't too big. She was exactly right. Strong enough to build a life from scratch, brave enough to love again after being hurt, gentle enough to nurture things that grew. In late autumn, as the first snow began to fall, Eleanor went into labor. The midwife, Mrs. Henderson, had been preparing for weeks. She had delivered hundreds of babies in her 40 years of practice, but she had never delivered a baby for a woman as large as Eleanor. There were concerns, complications that could arise. The labor lasted 14 hours. Eleanor refused to scream, her pride too great even in extremity. But she gripped Garrett's hand hard enough to leave bruises, and he stayed beside her the entire time, whispering encouragement, wiping sweat from her face, refusing to leave, even when Mrs. Henderson suggested he wait outside. I told you I would be here, he said. I meant it. Finally, as dawn light crept through the windows, their daughter was born. Mrs. Henderson wrapped the baby in a clean blanket and placed her in Eleanor's arms. The infant had dark hair like both her parents and lungs that worked perfectly, judging by the volume of her cries. Garrett looked down at his daughter and felt his heart crack open. 6 years ago he had held Rose for the last time, never knowing it would be the last time. He had missed her death, missed saying goodbye, missed everything that mattered. But now he was here, watching his new daughter take her first breaths, seeing Eleanor smile through tears of exhaustion and joy, being present for the moment that would define the rest of his life. What should we name her? Eleanor asked. Garrett thought of his first daughter buried in a cemetery 200 miles away, thought of Eleanor's only friend at the convent, Sister Mary Catherine, who had shown her that strength could be beautiful. "Margaret Rose," he said quietly, "after both the women who shaped us, if that's all right with you." Eleanor's eyes filled with fresh tears. "It's perfect." They called her Maggie for short. Maggie grew fast strong like her mother, curious like her father. By age 2, she was lifting things that should have been too heavy for her. By age 4, she was asking questions that made the adults around her think. By age 6, she was reading books that challenged children twice her age. She was also nearly as tall as other 8-year-olds, and the other children in Silver Ridge sometimes called her Giant Girl, repeating what they heard their parents whisper. Eleanor heard about it from Sarah Whitfield, who had become Maggie's teacher at the new school they had built together. That night, Eleanor sat on Maggie's bed and brushed her daughter's dark hair. "Sarah told me some children were unkind today." Maggie's face crumpled. "They called me giant, said I was too big to play with them." Eleanor set down the brush and pulled her daughter into her lap, even though Maggie was getting almost too large for it. "Do you know what I learned, Maggie? Being big isn't wrong. Being different isn't wrong. The wrong is in people who are too small in their hearts to see that different can be beautiful. But I don't want to be different. I want to be normal. Normal is overrated." Eleanor tilted Maggie's chin up so their eyes met. "You come from a long line of women who were told they were too much, too big, too strong, too different. But we survived. We thrived. We built lives worth living. Like you and Daddy. Exactly like me and Daddy. We were both told we were too broken for happiness, but we found each other and we built this." She gestured around the room at the house, at the life they had created. "Don't let other people's fear make you small, Maggie. You are exactly as big as you're meant to be." Maggie hugged her mother tight. "I love you, Mama. I love you too, my giant girl." The years passed in the way years do when life is full. Garrett turned 45, then 50, his hair going more gray than brown. Eleanor reached 35, then 40, her strength undiminished, her presence in Silver Ridge undeniable. They had 2 more children. William, born when Maggie was 3, who had his father's quiet intensity and his mother's quick mind. And Sarah, born when Maggie was 6, who came into the world laughing and never stopped. The school they had built grew from 1 room to 3. Sarah Whitfield ran it with Eleanor's help, teaching children of every background that knowledge was power and difference was strength. Garrett taught the older children wilderness skills, tracking survival, reading the weather, the same skills that had kept him alive through 20 years of guiding hunters and 6 years of self-imposed isolation. They were happy, not in the simple, uncomplicated way of people who had never suffered, but in the deeper, harder-won way of people who had looked at darkness and chosen light anyway. In 1918, the influenza epidemic swept through Silver Ridge. Eleanor worked herself to exhaustion, nursing the sick, using her strength to move patients to dig graves, to do the work that others couldn't. She was 72 years old, but still formidable, still capable of carrying a grown man on her shoulders if necessary. Garrett begged her to rest, to let the younger people take over. But Eleanor had spent 12 years being forced to work. She had spent the next 40 years choosing to work, using her strength for good instead of punishment. "This is who I am," she told him. "I can't stop now." She caught the flu in late autumn. It hit her hard, laying her low in a way nothing else ever had. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Wright Blackwell was weak. Garrett nursed her through it, doing for her what she had done for him after the avalanche, cooling her fever, forcing fluids, refusing to leave her side even when the doctor suggested he protect himself. "I told you I would be here," he said, echoing the words he had spoken at Maggie's birth. "I meant it." On a cold November afternoon, with autumn light slanting through the bedroom window, Eleanor knew she was dying. Garrett sat beside the bed holding her hand. At 79, he was still lean and straight-backed, still the mountain man who had saved her from Clayton Marsh's whip 44 years ago. "Garrett," her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here, my love. Do you remember the day you found me tied to that tree? Every second of it. Eleanor smiled, though it took effort. I was so afraid. Not of dying, of never having lived. Garrett's grip tightened on her hand. You lived, Eleanor. God, you lived so much. He looked around the room, seeing the evidence of their life together. Photographs on the walls, 3 children, 8 grandchildren, the school still running, teaching its 100th student, a town where difference was celebrated instead of punished. We built something good, Eleanor said. We built something extraordinary. She looked at him with eyes that were dimming but still full of love. Thank you for opening the gate that night. Garrett's voice broke. Thank you for knocking. Eleanor's breathing grew shallower. Her grip on his hand weakened. Garrett. Yes, my love. Wait for me. I'll find you again. She took one more breath, let it out slowly, and was still. Garrett sat with her until sunset, holding her hand, remembering every moment they had shared. The fear and the joy, the pain and the healing, the 44 years of choosing each other every single day. When he finally stood, his joints protesting, he leaned down and kissed her forehead one last time. Until we meet again, my giant girl. Garrett Blackwell lived 3 more years after Eleanor's death. He spent them with his children and grandchildren, telling stories about the woman who had been too big for heaven and too strong for hell, about how she had walked into his life during a blizzard and changed everything, about how love could heal even the deepest wounds if you were brave enough to accept it. On a winter night in 1921, Garrett lay in the bed he had shared with Eleanor for 44 years. Maggie sat beside him, holding his hand the way he had held her mother's. Is the school still open? His voice was faint. Every day, Papa. 32 students this year. Garrett smiled. Your mother would be proud. She is, and she's waiting for you. I know. Garrett's eyes drifted closed. I hear her sometimes, laughing. His breathing slowed. His hand relaxed in Maggie's grip. Go to her, Papa, Maggie whispered. We'll be okay. Garrett Blackwell took his last breath, thinking of Eleanor's smile. In the spring of 2024, a young teacher stood outside the Blackwell Wright Community School, watching children of every background run inside for the day's lessons. The school had been standing for 148 years. Through wars and depressions and social changes that would have seemed impossible to the people who built it, it had endured. On the wall inside hung a photograph of the founders, a tall woman with dark hair and fierce eyes, a lean man with a weathered face and a gentle smile. Beside the photo, Eleanor's words were carved into a wooden plaque. For every child who has been told they don't belong, you do. Love is bigger than hate. Strength comes in many forms, and there is always someone who will open the gate. The teacher, a direct descendant of Maggie Blackwell, read the words and thought of her great-great-grandmother, the woman who had been called a freak and a monster, who had been beaten and sold and hunted, who had survived it all and built something beautiful from the ashes of her pain. The school bell rang. Children poured through doors built tall enough for anyone to enter without bending. The teacher smiled and followed them inside. Outside, snow began to fall gentle and clean, covering the world in white. And if you listened very carefully, you might have heard something on the wind. 2 voices intertwined, a man's low chuckle and a woman's bright joy. Together again at last. In the end, every life is a story. Some stories are grand adventures, others are quiet tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. This is the story of Eleanor Wright and Garrett Blackwell, 2 broken people who found each other in the wilderness and refused to let the world tell them they were too damaged for happiness. They built a life. They raised children. They created a legacy that outlasted them by generations. And every child who walks through the doors of that school, every person who is told they are too different to belong, carries a piece of their story forward. Because love is bigger than hate, and there is always someone who will open the gate. The end.